Today is day 28, and today's story begins with a pattern. On March 21st, Trump gave Iran 48 hours to open the Strait of Hormuz. Iran did not comply. On March 23rd, Trump extended the deadline by 5 days. Iran did not comply. Today, March 27th, that 5-day window expired, and Trump extended the deadline again, this time by 10 days until April 6th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. He posted on Truth Social that the extension was made, quote, as per Iranian government request. Iran's foreign ministry said it made no such request. Let me be precise about what this pattern means, because it is the most important structural fact about this war right now. Trump has issued the same ultimatum 3 times. Each time the deadline arrives, he has backed away from the consequences he threatened. The first ultimatum was backed with the threat to obliterate Iranian power plants. The second was backed with a promise that talks were making major progress. The third, today, was framed as Iran asking for more time, a framing Iran publicly denied. The specific wording Trump used, as per Iranian government request, is worth examining. It is an attempt to portray the extension not as an American retreat from a failed threat, but as a gesture of American magnanimity toward a country that is supposedly asking for patience. Iran called it what it is, a U.S. maneuver to appear diplomatic while the military operation continues. Rabobank analyst Jane Foley, quoted by multiple outlets this week, said something about Iran's leverage that is analytically precise. Because the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, Iran has the power to effectively dictate the terms of any resolution. That is not a commentary. It is a description of the current strategic reality. Every time Trump extends a deadline, rather than executing the threat behind it, he confirms that assessment. The global market responded accordingly. On Thursday night, Wall Street posted its largest single-day decline since the war began. Oil prices rose sharply. Investors had been watching the 5-day window. When the window produced no deal, no reopened strait, and instead a new extension with a new deadline, the market concluded what everyone watching the diplomatic track already knew. There is no imminent resolution. Now to the G7, because what happened today in France is the most visible manifestation yet of the diplomatic isolation the U.S. is experiencing among its closest allies. Secretary of State Marco Rubio flew to the Vaux de Cernay Abbey outside Paris for a G7 foreign ministers meeting. Seated across from him, the foreign ministers of the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and Canada, plus EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas, and invited participants including Saudi Arabia, India, South Korea, Brazil, Ukraine, and others. The meeting was meant, in theory, to rally allied support for the American position and address the growing fracture between Washington and its traditional partners. It did neither. Germany's Foreign Minister Johann Vadeful called the war a catastrophe. The UK's Yvette Cooper said Iran cannot be allowed to hold the global economy hostage, but stopped short of offering any military commitment, calling instead for a swift resolution. France's position, as communicated before the meeting, is that this is not Europe's war. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte, in an interview over the weekend, had suggested European allies would come together to help secure the Strait of Hormuz, a statement that European governments immediately distanced themselves from. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kallas said flatly, "This is not Europe's war. We didn't start the war." And yet these same governments face an acute energy crisis of their own creation. Or rather, a crisis created for them by a war they were not consulted about before it began. Australian Prime Minister Albanese said publicly on Friday that Australia had not been consulted before the US and Israel launched their operation on February 28th. He was not alone. None of America's major Western allies were given advance notice of Operation Epic Fury. They were presented with a war as a fact and are now being asked by Rubio to share the cost of managing its consequences. That is not how alliance relationships work, and the Europeans, facing their own energy price pressures and economic slowdown, are not inclined to pretend otherwise. Rubio himself, speaking before flying to Europe, framed American expectations bluntly. Very little of our energy comes through the Strait of Hormuz. It's the world that has a great interest in that, so they should step up and deal with it. That framing, the U.S. launched the war that caused the strait closure, but the rest of the world should deal with the strait closure, is not a winning diplomatic argument. It is an accurate description of American strategic thinking, and it explains why allied governments are offering diplomatic statements of concern rather than naval assets. The G7 meeting did produce one development worth tracking. 22 nations, including some G7 members, signed a pledge to begin planning for an eventual mission to secure shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. The pledge is not a military commitment. It is a planning commitment. It does not open the strait tomorrow or next week, but it signals that Washington has, with significant diplomatic effort, assembled a coalition in principle that accepts the goal of reopening the waterway. Whether that coalition produces actual naval assets, and on what timeline, remains entirely open. Now to Russia. Because the EU's accusation today is significant and largely underreported. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas said on Thursday, during the G7 pre-meeting consultations, that Russia is providing intelligence to Iran to help it target Americans, to kill Americans. She also accused Russia of supplying drones to Iran for use in attacks against neighboring countries and U.S. military bases. These are not new concerns. The operational relationship between Russia and Iran has been visible since Russia began deploying Iranian-designed Shahed drones against Ukraine in 2022. But Kallas's statement, delivered in a formal diplomatic context to G7 foreign ministers, escalates the public framing of Russia's role from background supplier to active intelligence partner in a war against American forces. The strategic logic behind Russian support for Iran in this conflict is not complex. Russia benefits from every day this war continues. Elevated oil prices generate revenue for Moscow. American credibility erosion in the Middle East reduces the overall bandwidth Washington has to sustain pressure on Russia over Ukraine. A prolonged U.S. military commitment in the Gulf strains American defense production and reserve capacity. And every failed American ultimatum, like the 3 deadline extensions on Iranian power plants, reinforces the narrative, valuable to Moscow, that American threats are negotiable. Russia does not need Iran to win this war. Russia needs Iran to not lose quickly. That calculation helps explain something specific about the pace of this conflict. Iran's ability to continue launching drone and missile attacks despite 4 weeks of American and Israeli strikes, including the killing of multiple senior IRGC commanders, is partly explained by its own significant stockpiles and doctrine. But it is also potentially explained by the intelligence advantage Kallas described: advanced knowledge of targeting patterns, strike timing, and American operational plans that allows Iranian forces to adapt and survive. The WTO weighed in on Friday with an economic forecast that extends the OECD numbers published Thursday. If oil and gas prices remain elevated through the rest of 2026, the WTO projects global GDP growth will be reduced by 0.3 percentage points. Europe specifically could see GDP growth fall by at least 1 percentage point below prior estimates. The IMF's chief Kristalina Georgieva added that every 10% increase in energy prices over 2026 is expected to increase global inflation by approximately 0.5 percentage point. Oil is currently trading at levels roughly 45% above pre-war prices. The math of those projections is not favorable. The behavioral responses from individual countries are now becoming visible in ways that go beyond energy rationing. Bangladesh is closing universities early for summer due to energy constraints. Pakistan and the Philippines have both declared 4-day work weeks to reduce commercial energy consumption. New Zealand's finance minister outlined a 4-tier fuel restriction plan this week, noting the country is currently at phase 1, but publishing the criteria for escalation to rationing. France's finance minister said the world is now facing a conflict that has changed in nature, and that the economic consequences have changed accordingly, noting that 30 to 40% of Gulf refining capacity is damaged or destroyed. On the ground on Friday, Israel struck what the IDF called the most central naval arms production site in Iran, along with ballistic missile factories across Tehran and western Iran. Iranian missiles were tracked above the coastal city of Netanya. Iran launched 7 missile salvos at Israel within hours, many with cluster warheads, injuring 9 people. In Lebanon, an IDF officer and a soldier were seriously wounded in an operational accident during an encounter with Hezbollah in the south. An IDF soldier, Sergeant Aviad Elchanan Volansky, was buried at Mount Herzl Military Cemetery in Jerusalem, the 4th Israeli soldier killed in the Lebanon operation. In Kuwait, drones struck port infrastructure. In the Gulf, Iran's IRGC stated it had hit U.S. bases in the UAE, Bahrain, and Kuwait overnight. The news that most directly speaks to Iran's long-game strategy, however, is what its parliament is doing with the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian lawmakers are preparing draft legislation to formally codify Iran's sovereignty and oversight over the Strait of Hormuz into domestic law, and to create a formal revenue mechanism by charging tolls on ships transiting the waterway. GCC Secretary General al-Budaiwi confirmed on Thursday that Iran is already charging fees for safe passage on individual vessels, in violation of international law. Lloyd's List Intelligence had reported 2 weeks ago that at least 2 vessels had already paid large sums to Iran for strait transit. Now Iran is moving to make that practice statutory. This is not a wartime improvisation. This is a strategic signal about the post-war order Iran is trying to create. Iran is not positioning itself to lose the Strait of Hormuz at the negotiating table. It is positioning itself to emerge from this war as the recognized administrator of the world's most important energy waterway, either formally, through a peace deal that includes its 5 conditions, or de facto through the establishment of an extraterritorial toll regime that the global shipping industry has no practical choice but to accept. That ambition is what makes Iran's 5 counter-conditions, delivered through Pakistan on Thursday, so structurally significant. The demand for U.S. recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the strait is not a bargaining chip to be traded for sanctions relief. It is the entire endgame, and the legislation now moving through Iran's parliament is Iran building the institutional infrastructure for that endgame regardless of how the military conflict resolves. The U.S. is weighing deploying an additional 10,000 ground troops to the Middle East, according to reporting from the Times of Israel and other outlets citing U.S. officials. The UAE has reportedly signaled it would participate in a coalition force to open the Strait of Hormuz. That coalition, if assembled and operationally deployed, would represent the most significant escalation of the ground component of this conflict yet. But even a naval coalition force does not resolve the underlying problem. Iran has mined the strait, has missiles embedded in the mountains overlooking it, and has demonstrated it can absorb the killing of its top commanders without changing its strategic direction. Today's deadline extension buys 10 more days. April 6th is the new clock. The G7 has met and called it a catastrophe. The war continues, and Iran is writing laws to charge the world rent for its own oil. There is a final dimension to today that connects everything else, and it is the one that the daily news cycle rarely stops long enough to articulate clearly. This war began with a specific theory. The theory was that Iran, weakened by sanctions, battered by the June 2025 12-day war, politically unstable after the mass protests and brutal crackdown of January 2026, and now facing the most intensive air campaign in the history of the Middle East, would reach a breaking point. That the combination of decapitation, strikes killing its supreme leader, its intelligence chief, its IRGC Navy commander, its senior national security officials, combined with the destruction of 2/3 of its missile and drone production capacity, its air defenses, its navy, would force either regime collapse or capitulation on American terms. 28 days into the war, neither has happened. The regime has a new supreme leader. The IRGC continues to function. The parliament is passing legislation. Missiles continue to fly. The strait remains closed. And in Tehran last week, citizens held pro-government rallies under the portrait of Mojtaba Khamenei. What has happened instead is this: 1,900 Iranians killed, 82,000 civilian structures damaged or destroyed, 180,000 people displaced within Iran, more than 100 killed in Lebanon, millions displaced across the region, 13 American service members dead, and a global energy crisis that the IEA called the worst in history. The OECD is forecasting will add 1.2 percentage points to G20 inflation, and the WTO says could reduce global GDP growth by 0.3%. The theory has not produced the outcome. What it has produced is cost, distributed globally, absorbed by countries that had no vote in the decision to launch this war, and growing every day, the strait remains closed. The G7 foreign ministers understood this today in France. Their body language, their careful public statements, their refusal to commit military assets, all of it reflects the same calculation. This is a war of American and Israeli choice, and the rest of the world is being asked to pay for it while being given no role in ending it. That is not a sustainable alliance structure, and it is the quiet crisis underneath every missile count and deadline extension and diplomatic communique that comes out of this war. 10 more days until April 6th. The war continues. The bill is growing, and the theory that started it has not been proven right. I will see you in the next one.